Good evening. You are very welcome to this week's 120 Dublin Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum of Dublin. Now, I'm really looking forward to this week's conversation. Our guest is Eibhlin Colgan, who's the archive manager within the Guinness Archive. We have found a large number of times over the course of this series that the Guinness family and their impact has kind of naturally worked its way into the conversation. So I'm all too enthusiastic to actually dedicate a week to speaking about it. So to everyone who's with us here this evening, if you've got questions as we go through, please do type them in and I'll take some time with Eibhlin to go through them. But for now, Eibhlin, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely delighted. I'm going to jump straight in because I do have a lot of questions that I'd love to talk to you about. So going back to Arthur Guinness, we all know the story. He signs the lease for St. James's Gate. He signs a 9,000-year lease at a fixed rent price back in 1759 at the young age of 34. What was the founding mission? What was the organization he was setting up?
Yeah, so he has a really interesting background, actually. So I suppose brewing back in the 1700s was very much a small cottage industry. I always say, from a historical point of view, there's no such thing as a new idea. So back to the era of craft today is just like brewing was back in the 1700s. And brewing was very much in his blood. We know that his maternal grandfather, for example, had a license to brew ale as far back as the late 1600s, supplying ale to the British troops who were trooping up and down the road from Dublin down to Cork, kind of near where the N7 is today. So very much brewing was in his blood. And he set up a brewery in Leixlip in 1756 and came up to Dublin really to try and make his mark and his stamp on the brewing industry in Dublin at the time. We know he was really interested in different types of beers. We know that he was really respected actually by other Dublin brewers at the time. One of the fabulous items that we have within the archive collection is not actually a Guinness item, but it's the minute book of the Corporation of Brewers of Dublin. And we see that he's accepted into the Brewers Corporation Guild even before he signs the lease on New Year's Eve in 1759. So he is really respected as a brewer in Dublin, and a brewer of quality. He came right up within that organisation of the Guild of Brewers to become the master. And as such, he would have advocated for brewers in Dublin at different trade levels and different trade bodies. And he always talks about brewing with great quality ingredients. So I suppose a lot of those core principles that we definitely would stand for today were laid down by him in terms of his ethos right back in the 1750s.
It's amazing to see that the intention stands through as kind of time has gone on. And you mentioned his grandparents there. Like, what do we know about his parents and like his own personal upbringing, the environment that he grew up in?
Yeah, so we know a little bit about his mother's side. His mother was a Reed, very famous old Dublin name. So Reed Cutlers, just off Parliament Street, are part of the same family. So we know a little bit about his mother's family. I say we know that her father in turn, so Arthur's maternal grandfather, had a license to brew ale. They would have been small tenant farmers. They certainly wouldn't have been big landowners or wealthy landowners or anything like that. On his father's side, then it's a little bit more unknown, to be honest, where the Guinness name comes from. It's actually really interesting. One of the current members of the Guinness family, did some genetic studies with the genetic department within Trinity a couple of years ago, just to try and dig down exactly where the Guinness family comes from and the family name comes from. And more than likely it comes from an area of County Down where there is a hill called Guinness, Ginnis, and there's family names around there. But more than likely they were related to the McCartan family, who were from a township in County Down that bears some resemblance to the name Guinness. So that's where they came from. But about his father exactly, we know very, very little. We don't know anything about him until he lands in Selbridge in the 1720s and becomes in the employ of Dr. Arthur Price, who was an archbishop and whose homestead, I suppose, was in Selbridge. And that's really where we meet Arthur's father for the first time. So certainly wouldn't have come from a big landed gentry family or been very moneyed or anything like that, but would have been very well educated. So he did get a great start in life in terms of his education.
Okay, and it's funny because I kind of, in thinking about this conversation this evening, the thing that I was so aware of was Arthur Guinness is a name that we all know so well, but I actually knew nothing about him. So that's, even just to kind of get a small sense of the kind of the man behind the title is really wonderful. And I so when he started originally, my understanding is he started with ale, but then moved into porter, which was invented as a concept in London around the same time. And I kind of, do we know much about his journey into kind of developing what was going to go on to become the product that we know today?
So we know a little bit about it. I suppose one of the slightly frustrating things is that we're talking about something that happened 230, 240 years ago. So a lot of the records from that time don't survive in their entirety. But we do know that he absolutely, as you say, we would have started brewing ale, which would have been the predominant beer type that would have been brewed and enjoyed across Ireland and England actually at that stage. And then, as you referenced, porter was a relatively new drink in the early 1700s. It's said there's a couple of different origin stories and a different origin myths around where porter came from, but the one that's most attributed to was a brewer in London, a gentleman called Ralph Harwood, who in 1722, instead of brewing different strands of beer and to create a dark drink, he brewed one entire drink in one vessel. And brewed that using roasted, not quite roasted as we would know today, but very highly toasted barley, creating this dark drink. And this drink became really popular with the market porters of inner city London. So the likes of Covent Garden and Billingsgate. I always think of it as kind of big burly men carrying meat and fruit and vegetables all around the inner city markets. And that's where the name came from. Porter came from the men who were drinking it. So it was originally intended to be this labouring class of drink.
Mm.
And then what started happening was that it started being imported into Dublin. And the Dublin labourers, say around the Dublin dock, started drinking it. And then the Dublin brewers said, well, why are we allowing this imported ale to come in? Let's try our hand at it. So by no means was Arthur Guinness the inventor. There's a couple of origin myths around that. And not only that, but he wasn't the first Dublin brewer by any means to brew porter. But what he did was take an existing recipe, apply his principles, I suppose, of great quality ingredients, being very canny in where he set up his brewery, getting access to really good quality water, and very much took on a beer style and made it his own. And I suppose the rest is history. He made the big decision in 1799 that we do have recorded in our archive to stop brewing the traditional ales that everybody, as say, up to that point really would have been most drinking in Ireland, and concentrate solely on his version of porter. So he was really making his mark and staking his claim at something that he believed in. And definitely history has proven he made the right choice.
I was about to say that it does sound like that that gamble definitely did pay off. I see a question coming in from the live stream here that actually I'm curious to know the answer to. In relation to the duration of the long lease that Arthur signed originally, I don't know, do you have a sense, would a lease of, thousands of years have been usual at that time? Was it symbolic? Was it a legal entity? Was it unusual?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting one actually. So long leases would have been usual, but long leases to the tune of 9,000 years would have been quite unusual. In Irish legal leases, the number 9 comes up quite often. So you often get leases for 900 years or 999 years. But even in the registry of deeds, they would tell you today that a 9,000-year lease is extremely long. But the idea, I suppose, behind long leases, first of all, was, I suppose, politically what was going on in Ireland at the time in the late 1600s, early 1700s, was the era of the plantations. where Irish lands were being taken by the crown and off Irish people and being given to their lords and their earls. So a way of trying to keep Irish lands literally in Irish hands was to create these very long leases. So it doesn't quite explain why it's the 9,000 years, but just, I suppose, the context of long leases for land at that period of time in Ireland, the late 1600s, early 1700s, is very much bound into what was happening politically at the time.
And that's interesting, the fact that there was a political motive for it. I can see the logic of it when you're explaining it that way, but thank you for that.
I suppose it's interesting. It's the whole piece about Irish people wanting to own their own land, isn't it? You can see that going right back into history as true then as it is today.
Yeah, I think we continue to have that conversation. We see it playing out in the media on a day-to-day basis. And so Arthur, Arthur starts the company 59 and then, or 1759, but then he dies in 1803. At the point at which he dies, does he have any sense of the success and the scale of what the business is ultimately going to go on to be? Like, does he have some concept of the scale that the future had subsequently gone on to be?
Yeah, I would imagine to some degree, but I don't think, honestly, he could have imagined within 70 years of his death or 75 years of his death that the brewery would go on to be the largest in the world, which it did at that stage. So when he died in 1803, he left a substantial amount of money in his will. So he had amassed quite a good personal fortune within that stage. He, when he signed the brewery in 1759, he was lucky enough to have inherited £100 a few years previously from his godfather, which quite neatly was the same amount of money he needed as a down payment for that 1759 lease. But what's really interesting is that he married 2 years later. He married a lady called Olivia Whitmore, and she was a Dublin heiress, and she brought £1,000 with her to the marriage as part of her dowry. So behind every good man being a good woman and all that, I think we can definitely apply that to Arthur. So I suppose his wife definitely brought money to their partnership, which definitely would have helped him to expand. So we know that the first major expansion of the brewery would have happened around 1797, 1798. So within his lifetime, he was starting to physically expand the brewery, and he actually was starting to expand his markets. So by 1801, he wasn't just brewing for Dublin or for the rest of Ireland, which other Dublin brewers were doing, but he's the first brewer that we have evidence of within Ireland of starting to brew his beer for export. So again, within our archive collection, we actually have a recipe that's dated from December 1801. That's called West India Porter, and it's called that because it was a beer that was destined to go on a cargo hold ship for 3 or 4 months to the West Indies as far back as 1801. So yes, I do think he knew that he was definitely laying the foundations for an empire, but I don't think he could ever have believed that it would have been so successful.
Yeah, I would dare say that's an in your wildest dreams type situation. But when you mention his wife there a moment ago, I think Olivia, you said her name was. What do we know about her and the kind of the influence that she had, I guess, on him and his world?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I suppose, like a lot of women's stories and female stories from that period, they get written out of history an awful lot in terms of the documentation that survives. So we know a little bit about her background. To say, we know she was a Dublin heiress, so she came from money. We know that she was related to Henry Grattan, for example, the great 18th century parliamentarian, and that definitely would have been of advantage, I suppose, to her husband in terms of petitioning for Parliament. We know that he associated with Henry Grattan as well, so definitely probably she would have provided those introductions. She was also the matriarch of the family, so quite famously, in every tour bus in Dublin that passes by the brewery loves to tell the story, bus driver loves to tell the story of the fact that she bore Arthur 21 children. 10 of whom survived childhood, which sounds a horrific statistic to us today, but would have been not too uncommon, I suppose, for middle class family to have lost 1 and 2 children at childhood. But definitely the matriarch, I mean, she well outlived Arthur. 3 of her sons followed him into the brewery. So, you know, she was the matriarch of the family, albeit we don't know a lot about her personal ethos and her personal beliefs.
Okay, that scale of loss is staggering to think of now, but it's, as you said, kind of an insight into what life would have been like at that time. And one thing I found myself kind of just in the last number of months or the last year, we've all spent a huge amount of time going out and kind of visiting our parks and you know availing of the natural amenities and the resources that we have across the city. And you know it's fair to say that the Guinnesses have played a large role in opening up some of the key parks and buildings to the city. So could you tell me a little bit about the reach that they've had across the city in that sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it really is incredible that one family can have had such an influence in the city, and it really is Guinness being so synonymous with Dublin and vice versa. And from, I suppose, the ethos of the family going right back to Arthur was very much about giving back to communities. We know Arthur himself donated money to St. Patrick's Cathedral, which started a generations long association between the Guinness family and the cathedral, which very much still exists today and is very, very strong. And as the family got more and more wealthy and I suppose became more ingrained in Dublin cultural society, they started becoming really great benefactors back to the city. And a number of our big institutions would have benefited from patronage, I suppose, and benefaction by the members of the Guinness family over several different generations. But definitely when you're talking about parks, I think we all so appreciate green spaces now, don't we? Much more than we ever did in these COVID times. And actually, the Guinness family were responsible for 3 of the major parks that we have within the city today. So the biggest one, right across the road from yourselves, is St. Stephen's Green. So that would have been first laid out in the 1600s, but actually would have been a private park, just like Fitzwilliam Square is today, that only the key holders of the people in the beautiful grand houses around the green would have had access to the green. So Arthur Edward Guinness, who later was given the title of Lord Ordelon, he would have been Arthur Guinness's great-grandson. He purchased the ground rights to the park in the 1880s and handed them over to the city of Dublin for the citizens of Dublin to use. So literally broke down the walls, opened up the gates, and re-landscaped part of the park. And what we see today is very much his legacy. And there's a tribute to him in terms of a statue just opposite the Fitzwilliam Hotel on that side of the green, to Lord Ordelon as a thank you. And then I think for me, one of the absolute hidden gems within the city is the Ivy Gardens. And that would have been the private gardens to 80 St. Stephen's Green, which is now the Department of Foreign Affairs, or Ivy House. That would have been the Guinness family townhouse as purchased by Benjamin Lee Guinness, Arthur's grandson, and then subsequently built next door to and expanded to the frontage of Ivy House as we have it today. And the Ivy Gardens that came with that were purchased for the Great Exhibition of the 1840s and ultimately handed over to the state to become the Ivy Gardens as we have today. And then the other beautiful little park right in the heart of the Liberties that the Guinness family laid out was St. Patrick's Park. So that's the beautiful, almost sunken park that goes right up next to St. Patrick's Cathedral. It's quite hard for us to imagine now, but back in the 1890s, there would have been a huge amount of very, very, very poor tenement housing, literally built right up to the side, that northern side of St. Patrick's Cathedral. And as part of the whole Ivy redevelopment, which includes all those beautiful red brick Ivy buildings along Bull Alley, part of the thinking behind that was to clear a lot of the really poor tenement housing and to build proper housing, which they did in the form of the Ivy buildings, but also to create a green space. So that's Edward Cecil Guinness, the first Lord Iva, laid out St. Patrick's Park in the 1890s primarily as a green space for people who lived in the apartments, but not exclusively. It was open to all. And it's just such a beautiful space in the heart of the city now today.
Yeah, they're amazing assets that we have kind of been, I guess, gifted as a result of their kind of generosity. And when you were mentioning a number of the family members there, you kind of you mentioned what their titles were. Could you tell me a little bit about how their titles were received and kind of what the protocols around that were, or do we know?
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose as when starting with Arthur and then his son and grandson and great grandsons, as they moved on through the generations, the family themselves, as they became very, very wealthy in their own right, and very much were of the ethos that the right thing to do is to give back to the city and to the communities, not just to sit on their wealth, so to speak, but to make sure that people and communities were benefiting from them. So it was really as a result of that benefaction and that giving back to community that they were given titles by Queen Victoria at the time. So it was two brothers in particular. So Arthur Guinness's great grandsons, two brothers. The eldest was Arthur Edward Guinness, and he was given the title of Lord Ordelone. So he's the gentleman behind St. Stephen's Green. He died without, he did marry, but he and his wife didn't have any children, so that title died out with him. But Lord Ordelone, at that stage, the Guinness family would have owned Ashford Castle and would have had huge influence in Cong and that part of, and Loch Corrib and that part of the world. So the Ordelone title comes from all the time that they would have spent in Galway and Mayo. And then his younger brother, Edward Cecil Guinness, who actually went on to purchase his elder brother's shares in the brewery and ultimately take over the brewery. He was given the title of Lord Iva by Queen Victoria. And it's interesting, actually, even to go back to your first questions about where the Guinness family came from. Iva was one of the titles of one of the very old Irish lords who would have fled Ireland during the flight of the flight of the Earls in the 1690s, and that title of Lord Iva came from the same part of County Down where Arthur's father is said to have come from. So, as part of the when Edward Cecil Guinness was being approached by the monarchy to ask him what title he would like to take, he revived this family tradition of this is where the Guinnesses had come from, and he revived the title of Iva. So there had been a previous Lord Iva, no connection to the current Guinness family, but the title was revived by him in the 1890s. So he was initially a lord and then elevated to earldom by 1919.
Okay, it's interesting. It sounds like we are, that Dublin is fortunate that Guinness ultimately ended up landing in Dublin rather than down, because it's kind of, as you're stating, there is quite a strong kind of familial connection to that area of the country as well. And kind of just talking about, the home of Guinness and where the brewery was based. Like I saw that it was by the end of the 19th century, the brewery was nearly 60 acres in size. It had its own railway and its own fire brigade, and it was effectively being perceived as a city within a city. I guess that made me start to think about community and this idea that, there was this kind of standalone ecosystem that was existing down in James's Gate. And I'm kind of wondering how that has evolved over generations.
Yeah, again, it's a really interesting one, and I love that phrase, "a city within a city." It's one that I use often, and it's so true because it does sum up. You have St. James's Gate, what happened within the 60 acres and the walls of the brewery, but equally what happened outside of those 60 acres, and especially the Liberties area of Dublin, which has had such a huge influence on the Guinness has had such an influence on over the generations. So by the 1880s, by the 1830s, first of all, Guinness was the largest brewery in Ireland. And then by the 1880s, it was the largest in the world. And by being the largest in the world, that meant obviously that there had to be a huge workforce working within the brewery to be able to brew that amount of beer, to be able to distribute it, and everything that went with that. So the brewery was actually the largest private employer in the city. And again, kind of like the ethos that we talked about of the Guinness family giving back to Dublin City, even kind of before they started doing that, they were very conscious of being a good employer. And there's a quote from one of the one of the Guinness families in the 20th century about being a good citizen, and that's something that they really firmly believed in. Last year, for example, we celebrated 150 years of the Guinness Medical Centre. So we've had doctors, nurses, physiotherapists in a completely male-dominated workforce in the early 20th century. The brewery employed a midwife to look after the wives of brewery men, which is a story I love. Back as far back as the 1860s, the brewery were providing pensions to all their workers, and by the 1880s that had become non-contributory. And again, if you think of what was going on outside of the world of Guinness, if you didn't work at that stage in the 1880s, 1890s, you did not have an income. There was no such thing as social welfare. There was no such thing as a government pension. And here is a company providing a pension on your retirement from the job. So they really built up this great loyalty, I suppose, because of that as well. And one of the large parts of our collection that we hold in the archive are actually personnel files of people who worked in the brewery, and you can really see the family connection. So you have fathers and sons and grandfathers and granduncles working in the brewery. Then they're going home and they're living next door to somebody who worked in the brewery. They're probably marrying the daughter of somebody who worked in the brewery. So you get this kind of whole network of streets all around Guinness. If you think like right from the Coombe to Reginald Street, Thomas Court, all those streets, pretty predominantly housing Guinness employees. So it was yes, what went on within the gates, but actually what went on outside of those gates, and the building of that community is a great legacy that Guinness has left within that area.
Yeah, and I saw I saw pull a statistic off the internet, but I saw a figure that said back in the 1930s, 1 in 30 people in Dublin were dependent on Guinness for their livelihood. Is that correct?
Isn't that incredible? I mean, there'd be the equivalent maybe of Harland and Wolff in Belfast, but other than that, Guinness was the big industry in Ireland, or certainly in the Republic at that stage. And when you think about 1 in 30, it's just an incredible statistic. And that's due to the prevalence, certainly, of Guinness as being the dominant employer within the city. I mean, you're talking about a workforce of maybe 4,500, 5,000. Again, predominantly men at that stage, and women were starting to come in the early 20th century, but it was still predominantly a male workforce by the 1930s. But then if you think about the barley farmers that were supplying grain into Guinness, so Guinness supporting them that way. And then also the publicans. If you went into a pub in Ireland in the 1920s, 1930s, you didn't have the array of gin bars that you do now. It very much would have been porters and stouts and whiskey. So Guinness would have been, the one of the main suppliers to the thousands of licenses that were around the country. So when you stack all that up together, there really would have been a huge economic force within the country.
Yeah, it makes good sense when you outline it. It seemed incredibly high when I read that online, but it's when you break it down, I can see how. And actually, just a question that someone has put in here is, and I guess when we're talking about the number of generations back that Guinness has been an employer within the local community, how has the religious breakdown of the workforce kind of evolved over time? Would it have been a traditionally Catholic or Protestant workforce, and how did that evolve?
Yeah, absolutely. So traditionally there would have been a divide. It wasn't deliberately along religious lines, but it was more that the labouring classes, as a very general sweeping statement in Ireland in the early 1900s, would have been largely Catholic, and your educated, university educated workforce would have been largely Protestant. I mean, if you think like Trinity College didn't accept Catholics into the university until the mid 20th century. So I suppose what was happening in Guinness was very much a reflection of that, what was happening in broader society. So it's not to say that there weren't any Protestant labourers, there absolutely were, but they just would have been in the minority. But it wasn't discriminatory. You could not be a labourer in Guinness if you were Protestant or Church of Ireland. And then there was, I suppose, that kind of breakdown into the higher ranks of the brewery. Top management within the brewery, you would have had the Guinness family, then you would have had the brewers, and up until the 1950s, 1960s, the brewers had to have a first class degree from either Oxford or Cambridge to become a brewer in Guinness, and that pretty much by definition meant that you were going to be of a Protestant background, because they mainly would have been English brewers coming over. And then under that level of management, you would have had what were known as number one clerks, which would have been very senior clerical managers, and then what were known as number two clerks, who would have had desk jobs. And by kind of the 1950s, 1960s, that very rigid hierarchy starts to break down in the brewery, just as it was breaking down, I suppose, in society generally. And you do start getting more well-educated Catholics appearing in more managerial positions within the brewery. But absolutely, it is true, there would have been, in a generality, there would have been a Protestant management and a Catholic workforce. That's absolutely true, but it wasn't written in stone or anything like that. It was more a reflection of the way that society was at the time.
Yeah, okay, no, and the kind of the circumstantial impact of that you can understand, or you can see. And it's interesting that you're kind of saying that the brewers would have been trained in Oxford, or I think it was Cambridge, you said was the other one, and then come to Ireland, because obviously we didn't have homegrown educational opportunities for brewers here, is the impression I'm getting. But am I right in thinking that you have always had a relationship to Trinity? Is it that the brewery has had a strong connection?
Yeah, absolutely. Breweries always had a strong connection with Trinity, and more so the Guinness family actually, rather than the brewery. So the Edward Cecil Guinness, Lord Diva, was Chancellor of the college, as was his son. But it is interesting when the era of scientific brewing came into the brewery, which was around the 1890s. They specifically looked for science graduates from Oxford or Cambridge. So I've no idea what the level or the reputation of science at Trinity was at that stage, but they very deliberately only sought candidates from Oxford and Cambridge for that 30-40 year period, from the late 1800s to the early 1900s.
Okay, and then like that kind of leads me on to look at changes and advancements that have happened. Like when you look back through your archive, do you get much of a sense of how engineering advances and progress has actually influenced the way production has run over the generations?
Very much so. So the engineering collection within the archive is really, really robust. And if you think right back to 1759 or the 1760, indeed, when Arthur would have started brewing, there's no steam engines at that stage. Everything would have been horse powered. So like the advances in technology that the brewery or the brewery site has seen since 1760 is absolutely incredible. And first steam powered engines to fire the brew house would have come in around 1816, 1817. So literally the first 50 years would have been horse drawn. The Victorian brewery that was built in the 1870s, when it was built, it was state of the art. It was known around the world within the brewing industry as being absolute state of the art. But that again would have been steam powered. So it's not 100 years later till the brewery becomes fully automated in the 1880s. And then now today again with our new brew house that opened just a few years ago down by the River Liffey. Again, when that was built, it was built to the highest of sustainability and environmental standards at the day. So those leaps in technology have just been absolutely incredible. One of our master brewers on site, now I won't give away his age, but he did start about 40 years ago, and like he remembers still working in the old Victorian brewery, which was still going like in the late 70s, early 80s. So the advancement, particularly in the last 40 years in terms of science, in terms of technology, is just absolutely phenomenal.
Amazing. And like when we're talking about aging things and kind of dating things, how long has the archive been in existence? At what point was it realized that this was something that needed to be established and remembered and protected?
Yeah, so formally the archive was established back in 1998, 99, so just over 20 years ago. So we've inherited 240 years of history. But there definitely, and I genuinely feel there was always a sense by the Guinness family of that they were creating something really special in the moment, which sometimes is, it's that it kind of sounds obvious now looking back on it, but it's not the normal course of things. So there would have been and there still is, a massive big walk-in vault on site where the most historical documents were always kept. So even the fact that that big vaulted door was there, thought went into that in the 1880s, that they wanted to protect their history. That's where the original lease was kept for absolutely years until it moved over to me in the archive. So there was definitely always a sense by the Guinness family of the importance of what they were creating and to record that. And then I suppose when the archive was set up in 98, 99, our role as archivists at the time was not just to look through that amazing vault full of the most important documents, but actually to go through the whole 60-acre site and find all the rest of the magic material. And the first years literally were in boiler suits, going, I remember jumping over doors in the old garage nearly 20 years ago, looking for material. So one of the great advantages, I suppose, of working at St. James's Gate and being at St. James's Gate is that the brewery has never moved over the years. So sometimes it's easier to make a decision to chuck something in an attic or put something in a basement rather than make a very definitive decision to put it in the skip or to throw it out. So we've been very fortunate, I think, by the fact that the brewery hasn't moved over the years. And we have an enormous collection, thankfully, as a result of that.
Yeah, and I think knowing what goes into caring for and preserving our collection, I can dare not even imagine what those first few years must have been like when you were trying to actually kind of unpack and better understand the site, let alone kind of, what had been kind of corralled into one fixed area. And like when you go through your archive, and I know this was something that we collaborated on in an exhibition a number of years ago, like through your archive, you have been able to look at key world events. Like I'm thinking about the World War, that through your personnel records, you were actually able to look at the experiences of Irish people getting involved.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think it's interesting when people think about the Guinness Archive, or maybe their perception of the Guinness Archive, you would assume that we would have brewing records, which we absolutely do. But we have so much more than that, and that is definitely a reflection of the role of Guinness within Ireland and within society. Because we, as you quite rightly say, it's a company that has survived the First World War, we've survived the Second World War, we have evidence of the impact of the Spanish flu back in 1918 on the brewery population through to our medical centre records. And yeah, I think that the stories that go along with the First World War are really incredible. I mean, it affected so many people within the brewery. Obviously, it affected the greater population, but when you look at the brewery population as a microcosm of what was going on, 800 men left the brewery to go fight in the First World War. Just over 130 of those didn't return. And we have the names of all of those people. We know what the company did for the families of those who didn't return. While the men were at the front, there was a war gifts committee set up, and I always think of it as all the wives at home knitting furiously all these care packages that were going out to men at the front. And we have these incredible letters for men in the trenches writing to the senior directors within the brewery, thanking them for the matches and lighters that they're giving them in care packages, and just talking about life in the trenches. Obviously not being too graphic about when they're writing back, but it's incredible insights. And then one of our ships, the very first Guinness ship, was actually torpedoed. In 1917, she was torpedoed by a German U-boat just off the Kish lighthouse, with a loss of several Guinness men. It kind of just goes on and on. The impact of the war on, I say, that microcosm that is the population of the brewery, is just really incredible. And all of that is recorded in our records, which is amazing. 1916, obviously another seminal moment in our national history, and we have eyewitness reports by the head brewer, by the Guinness family, who were living in Farmley at the time, talking about the smoke coming up over the city. During the week, you couldn't cross the city, as you know, because there was curfews. It was just too dangerous to be caught in the crossfire. So people slept within the brewery, they didn't leave, they continued brewing to make sure that the yeast didn't die during that week. So just amazing stories coming out of it.
But it sounds like your collection or your archive, I should say, very honestly collects human experiences and actually gives us an insight into the experience of the individual, not just purely kind of corporate statistics, which is an amazing wealth that people actually had the foresight to collect that level of data.
Very much so. And I mentioned earlier that we do have personnel files of people who work in the brewery, and I think they really epitomize the detail, I suppose, and the level of detail that management went into when looking after their employees. So we hold well over 26,000 personnel files. And I always say to people, if you're interested in genealogy and you had family who worked in Guinness, you've really struck gold, because it's, for anyone who's done family history research, the census is an amazing record, but it's one line in a census entry. If you'd worked with the brewery for 40 years, you have a huge, big, thick dossier sitting in our archive that will tell you when the person was born. Potentially there might be a birth cert, which will obviously bring you back a previous generation. It'll give a recommendation from a previous employer, or if you came in as a boy age 14, where you came in your exam, what your previous schooling had been, what your medical was, so how many teeth you had, whether you had your vaccinations, very topical at the moment. If you got married and availed of the Guinness Permanent Building Society to get a low-cost home from your house, that's all recorded. When you went out on pension, all the details of your family are recorded then, because if you had a wife, if you had children under 18, that determined the different levels of pension. So all of that is recorded. If you had a workplace accident, early health and safety was recorded back in the 1880s, and that gives people's addresses. So the level of detail is incredible, and you can really just build up a picture of what working life was like, because the great and the bad were recorded. If you spent too much time in the latrines, if you were caught smoking, that's all recorded on your sheet as well. So it's just really interesting. If you came up with a suggestion, they had a suggestion scheme where you were awarded money, and that's all recorded. And the level of detail is just phenomenal.
It's a really interesting social history, though, that kind of access to that sort of material. First of all, if you are the family member of past generation employees, who I think many of us who grew up in the city are, and being able to see that, but also just kind of for researchers more generally. And so it's really fascinating, and kind of changing subject a bit, but kind of something that I found particularly interesting when I was doing a little bit of research before today. I know with the pubs closed over the last kind of largely over the last year, one conversation that my partner regularly laments is the inability to get a pub drawn pint of Guinness. And, you know, the proper pint, the pint on tap, as we kind of, you know, I guess has holds so much affection locally. This only came about in the 1960s.
Absolutely. So 1959 is when Guinness Draft was officially launched and officially born. So just 61 years ago, which is kind of incredible when you think, you think that it's been around in that format for so long. So pre 1959, I should say, it was a carbonated product in a bottle. So we still sell it today. It's called Guinness Extra Stout or Guinness Original. It's the Guinness that you'd put in your Christmas puddings if you make them at Christmas time. So that would have been the traditional Guinness up until the late 1950s, when one of the Guinness brewers in our brewery in London, in Park Royal, was experimenting with nitrogen, and he was being able to insert and inject nitrogen into beer in order to be able to dispense it like we do today, perfectly in the pub. And that gave rise, almost as a secondary nature, it gave rise to that creamy head on the top of a pint of Guinness that's actually made up of millions of nitrogen bubbles. So yeah, the pint of Guinness, that's so iconic to us, that everybody's talking about wanting it's almost like a symbol of freedom, isn't it? Or in the midst of COVID or post-COVID, when we can get out again. It is relatively new in terms of 260 years of Guinness history. It's only 60 years old. So yeah, it's really interesting when you look at it that way.
Yeah, that was something I found particularly interesting. That's something I know I'll be kind of talking about in conversation for weeks to come. But just kind of, I guess, talking about the identity of Guinness for a little bit. Like, my understanding was it was Benjamin Guinness in the 1850s who actually started doing the kind of trademarking of creating the kind of the logo and the kind of the visual identity as we know it today. And the harp was incorporated into that design very early on. Do we know much about the decision process and kind of how that was landed on as an icon?
I always say to people, it's the one thing above all else I would love to have in the archive is the letter from Benjamin Lee saying, this is exactly why I chose the harp. Unfortunately, we don't have that, but we can give a good guess in terms of the context of what was happening. So by the 1860s, Guinness was starting to be sold all over the world. I mentioned earlier about a recipe book that we hold in the archive from 1801 that talks about a West Indies porter recipe. So really Guinness was starting to seed out around the world. And by the 1860s, it was in America, it was in continental Europe, it was in Africa. We've been in Africa nearly 200 years, which is such a strong market for Guinness today. And by the 1860s, the Guinness family were really looking for a symbol that would absolutely identify Guinness and the beer as being an Irish product. And how Ireland, as we know, would have been perceived overseas in the 19th century was very much linked to our culture, very much linked to our gift of the gab, and our music and everything like that. And the harp really was the one symbol that symbolized that greatness of Irish culture. So if you think back to the harps being played at the royal houses of Tara, the symbolism of the nomadic harpist going from lordship to lordship. So Guinness decided to use the harp, but actually not just any harp. So the Guinness harp is based on the very famous and very beautiful Brian Boru harp, or the O'Neill harp. As you know, it has two names that's preserved today in Trinity. So it wasn't just any harp, it was specifically the O'Neill harp. So that was used on our very first label, which was produced in 1862. Prior to that, Guinness would have just been put into wooden casks in the brewery, but Guinness literally carved out of the top, on the top of the wood. But by the 1860s, we now had a label to put on your bottle with a harp on it. And then it was trademarked in 1876.
Okay.
So we've been using it as a trademark for over 150 years.
It's amazing. And then like Benjamin, who was kind of at the heart of the labeling and this trademarking process, as I understand it, he was actually in the mid 1850s, I think it was, he was Lord Mayor of Dublin. Is that correct? That we had a Guinness in the Mansion House?
Yeah, absolutely. He was Lord Mayor of Dublin in 1850, and he was succeeded by George Rowe, who was the famous distiller, also on Thomas Street as well. So yeah, he was Lord Mayor of Dublin, and I suppose that just shows how within just 2 generations of Arthur Guinness, because Benjamin Lee would have been Arthur's grandson, the family had become, I say, so successful, both in not just in a commercial point of view, but were really starting to be integral to Dublin's social and political life as well. So yeah, he would have been Lord Mayor of Dublin. He was also a member of Parliament. He was an MP for Dublin as well, and so subsequent generations of the family would have got involved in political life as well.
Mm. And kind of Guinness was one of those interesting brands early on where you were very heavily reliant on word of mouth and actually, consumer interest to kind of build awareness of it early on. But then once you did start marketing, I think the organization has come up with slogans that probably every person, if not every second person who's on this conversation with us this evening, probably would have a Guinness slogan in the back of their mind that they're familiar with. Like, there are a few really recognizable sentiments. And, I kind of, a very large task, but I wonder if you could kind of, run me through some of the highlights and some of the kind of key slogans that you remember when looking through the archive.
Yeah, absolutely. So it would have started back in 1929, which is coming up to 100 years ago now, which obviously is a long time, but actually it was 170 years after Guinness was born before they started advertising. So in the marketing world that we live in now, it's incredible to think there was a brand in existence for 170 years with zero marketing. And so 1929 was the first year that Guinness started advertising. And they very famously chose the slogan, "Guinness is good for you." The thinking was that they went around the pubs, or certainly the people from the ad agencies went around the pubs in London, where the agency was based at the time, and asked people literally, "Why are you drinking Guinness?" And at that stage, Guinness would have been linked to different health benefits, not a claim by any means that we would stand over today, but it would have been at the time. And Guinness is good for you came back literally out of the mouth of consumers, out of the mouth of drinkers. So that was the very first one. And then into the 1930s, you have the incredibly talented artist called John Gilroy. And he worked for the Guinness advertising agency, and he created some beautiful adverts for some other brands as well, actually Coleman's and Mustard and brands like that. And Bovril he would have done work for, but probably most famously known for his work on Guinness. So he was the one who created the toucan and all of the different circus animals. He actually he painted the caricature of the zookeeper as a reference to himself. It's a caricature of himself, which I think says a lot about him and his humor. So those slogans would have been, "My goodness, my Guinness, have a Guinness when you're tired, lovely day for a Guinness, Guinness for strength." So all those kind of retro adverts that you would think of, they all came from him. And then coming into the 70s and 80s, you have a Guinness Tonight. You have Pure Genius coming in the 80s. Not Everything in Black and White Makes Sense was a big campaign that ran in the 90s. Our very famous TV ad, The Surfer, where you have the horses going in and out through the waves with the surfers, that was shot in black and white. That the slogan is "Not everything in black and white makes sense." Or sorry, "Good things come to those who wait." Beg your pardon, was that one. So loads of different slogans, but definitely ones that have gone into the cultural psyche. I mean, my goodness, my Guinness, you can't but go to an Irish pub abroad and see those posters. And even "Good things come to those who wait" is something that's being revived by the brand today, actually. certainly in light of COVID and what we were talking about earlier, that anticipation of your first pint back in the pub. So that's a slogan that we're reintroducing again.
Yeah, and I guess it's interesting to see how a heritage message can kind of, in a different context, can come back to relevance again today. And an unfair question to ask, but when I talk to anyone who manages and protects an archive, it's always my favorite question to know the answer to. If you were to tell me what your personal favorite piece in your collection is and why, what would that be?
That really is like asking me who's my favorite child. I only have one
I
child, but I still would find that that question hard to answer. I think it depends on the context. If so, I might choose 2 or 3 pieces if that's okay. I would have to say the lease, because it's our foundation document. It's the reason why we're here as Guinness 260 years later. But importantly for me, it actually bears Arthur's signature. So I genuinely, every time I see it, I think that of him standing where I'm standing with a feather and quill, actually putting his name to this document. So like absolute goosebump moment every time I think about it. So would definitely be the lease. I adore the John Gilroy artwork, and part of our collection, we're so blessed to have an awful lot of his original drawings. So we have his pencil sketches of the toucan, of some of the different animals, and actually you can just see what a talented artist he was when you see all the different pieces of artwork. So some of those original sketches I would really love. And then it's a massive collection, but in terms of one sub part of the collection, it's actually those personnel files I talked about, because Guinness as a brand is about people, it's about communion, it's about bringing people together, and it's about the people who have been involved in the generations of making Guinness. And I just think the fact that the company invested all those years ago in putting together these collections of papers about people who worked for them just is a huge tribute to the employees. And I just feel so honored to be able to curate those and that they're part of the collection today. So I don't think I'd fit all 26,000 in my hand if I was to bundle them up by any means, but just as an idea, I suppose, as a part of the collection, I just think there's something really powerful in the fact that that collection exists within the archive.
I think it is the human element, and I think especially with the year and a bit that we've all been living through, I think we've had time to reflect on the importance of the individual and the human and the kind of the real experiences. A few people have put some lovely reflections thinking about their own kind of family connections to Guinness, and I see someone has written in, Louise is saying that her grandparents went for a pint for her grandfather and a glass for her grandmother every night of their lives together, and they'd come back holding hands even in their twilight years, which I think is a particularly sweet story. That's lovely. And so just as kind of a concluding thought, if either I'm fascinated by what I've heard you talk about tonight and want to know more, or if I've got family that I want to go in and find out a bit more about and to use the personnel files and to access them as you're talking about, how would I do that?
Yeah, so the archive is publicly available, but it is by appointment, and especially in the times that we're in terms of quarantining material and everything like that, it does have to be by appointment. So our email address is the best way to get to us, because we're not always on site at the moment, but it's guinness.archives@diageo.com. And that's the best way of getting to us. If you are looking up your family history, if you can give us as much information as you can about the individual you're looking for. As I mentioned, we do have 26,000 personnel files, which means we have about 300 John Burns. So just to try and give us as much detail as you can so that we can correctly identify the person that you're looking for. And we do have some material up on our website as well. So the archive is part of the Guinness Storehouse. And on the Storehouse website, there is an archive section, and we do have a gallery there with some of our beautiful old photographs and some fact sheets on the history of Guinness. And we actually do have an online database for our genealogy files as well. So that would be a first point of call, but certainly very open to people contacting us directly. So it's guinness.archives@diageo.com.
Eibhlin, amazing. Thank you so much. This has been an absolute treat of an hour. And it's kind of one of those things that yourself and your colleagues, even in the early days of the little museum, you were amazing supporters and ambassadors to us. And that's something I'll always personally hold great kind of gratitude to you for. But it's been really wonderful to actually hear the stories that you've been sharing this evening. Sincerely, thank you so much for taking the time. I really do appreciate it.
Not at all. Thank you so much. And apologies to everybody about the delay on my video. I am aware of it, but there was nothing I can do. So apologies for that. Technology letting us down. But thank you for the invite. It was lovely to chat.
No, I'm delighted. To everyone who's been here, thank you all so much. And we'll see you again next week. But that's it for this evening's 120 Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum. Our guest this evening being Eibhlin Colgan, the archive manager from the Guinness Archive. So Eibhlin, best of luck with the reopening of the storehouse, hopefully in the days and weeks to come. And thank you so much. Good evening.
Great. Thank you. Good evening.